Through Fire and Water, Chapter 6, Baki B'Shoyev. When the Maggid of Mezrich first came to the Baal Shem Tov, he stayed with him for months. Reb Noson was also inclined to remain with Rebbe Nachman for an extended period in order to savor his newfound Gan Eden. But the Torah teaches, honor your father and mother. And for the sake of domestic peace, Reb Noson knew he must return to Nemirov. He went back the day after Yom Kippur. He had been away from home for almost 2 weeks, having left 3 days before Rosh Hashanah. On Erev Rosh Hashanah, Reb Noson's father had confidently assumed that he would come back that day so as to spend Yom Tov at home. When he didn't, Reb Nachman had been furious. But for all his opposition to Chassidus, a father knows his son. Reb Nachman knew his son was highly intelligent and an outstanding scholar. He wouldn't let himself be fooled, even in Chassidus. Reb Nachman realized that Reb Noson must have tasted something extraordinary in Breslov. Nevertheless, when he finally came home, Reb Nachman received him with undisguised disapproval. Reb Noson's wife, Esther Shendel, was even more unhappy. The responsibility for running their business had fallen on her shoulders. Even though she often used to mind the store, Reb Noson would at least take care of the bookkeeping and inventory. The extra worries caused by his 2-week absence made her extremely upset. As for Reb Noson himself, one of the most important lessons he had learned in Breslov was not to allow obstacles from those around him, not even the opposition of those closest to him, to distract him from his quest. If his search was a valid one, they would come round in the end, as indeed they did. In later years, his wife and father gave him their full support. Accordingly, on his return to Nemirov, Reb Noson threw himself into his devotions with all his heart, and he prayed loudly with hand clapping and joy, for this was one of the main things he had learned in Breslov. But there was no great joy in Nemirov. Before he went to the Rebbe, Reb Noson was an important person in town. His father was wealthy and himself a lamdan, while Reb Noson was even more highly respected for the breadth and depth of his learning. But his new arousal to Avodas Hashem evoked powerful feelings of jealousy in the Rav of his shul and several of the young lamdanim in town. They urged Reb Nachman to stop his son from seeing Rebbe Nachman. Otherwise, they told him, he'll become one of the vidoy-nickers. And that certainly won't be an honor for Reb Nachman, and especially not for Reb Noson's father-in-law, Reb David Tzvi Orbach. Sukkot was beginning, and Reb Noson surely wanted to fulfill the mitzvah of visiting one's teacher on the Chag. However, because of his family's opposition, he remained in Nemirov for the entire holiday. He had plenty to do. The Rebbe had given him a large number of shiurim. One of the reasons was to keep him so busy that he wouldn't even have the time to listen to his family's complaints. In addition, Reb Noson wanted to practice hisbodedus, but he faced many obstacles. In its very nature, hisbodedus is a private practice. But in his father's house, he did not have a room he could call his own. Even when he found somewhere quiet, people would often come in and suddenly disturb him. He therefore decided to go outside the city and pray in the surrounding fields and meadows. But then another problem arose. Since he was well known in the city, people would wonder why he was going out to the fields every day. Reb Noson decided to go out in the middle of the night when everyone was asleep. At home, they would think that he was going to shul to learn. This worked for a while, until some of the younger men in town found out about it. Fortunately, however, they understood Reb Noson's reluctance to have this publicized, and they kept quiet about it. As there were more than 10 Breslov Chassidim in Nemirov, they decided to make their own minyan. For a shul, they used Reb Nachman's sukkah, which was quite large, and they used his Sefer Torah. They prayed with great fervor, crying loudly and clapping their hands, and they sang the songs and melodies they had heard from Rebbe Nachman while in Breslov. They were happy to be able to fulfill the mitzvah, to rejoice on your festival. V'samachta b'chagecha. Rebbe Nachman once said about their minyan, "Who knows what could have happened if your minyan had continued? Your minyan used to split the heavens open." They celebrated Simchas Torah with Reb Noson in his father's house. And when they spoke about the Rebbe and sang his Zemiros, they virtually climbed the walls with yearning. They all regretted not having once traveled to see the Rebbe during Sukkot. They decided to hire a coach and go to Breslov directly after making Havdalah that night after Yom Tov. There was a Chassidic custom to continue the Simchas Torah celebrations into the night. They reckoned that since it would only take about 2 hours to get to Breslov, they would be able to spend some time there and return home without anyone being any the wiser. People would think they were out celebrating the end of Yom Tov with their friends. During the Simchas Torah celebrations, Reb Noson had kept on stealing out to go to his room and learn his daily share of 18 chapters of Mishnah. His father was wondering why he left his guests, which he did not feel to be in good taste. He asked his attendant what Reb Noson was doing. The attendant replied that Reb Noson was studying his 18 chapters of Mishnah, and added that they were all planning to travel to Rebbe Nachman after Yom Tov. Reb Naftali Hertz became furious. "The Rebbe gives my Talmud Chacham son Mishnah to study." He was also extremely upset about the proposed visit to Breslov. Reb Naftali Hertz called Reb Noson and said, "If you go, do not return to my house." Reb Noson did not relent. He did not even return home to change out of his Yom Tov clothes, for fear of his family's opposition to the trip. About halfway to Breslov, there was a downpour, and they were forced to stop at a roadside inn for about 2 hours. Reb Noson's expensive clothes became soiled in the rain. After the rains let up, they continued to Breslov, but travel was slow due to the mud. There was no asphalt or paved roads in those days. They arrived in Breslov about an hour before midnight and started singing Hakitzu Varananu Sheikhne Breslov. That's quoting a pasuk in Yeshaya. "Rejoice and shout, you dwellers of Breslov," waking up some of the residents. When they came to Rebbe Nachman, he was sitting at his table with some of the townspeople. The Rebbe received the group from Nemerov with great warmth, giving them some drink and Yom Tov cakes. The Yom Tov cakes were called lekach. That's Yiddish. Reb Nachman said to them, the pasuk says, "Ki lekach tov nosati lachem teirasi al tazevu." I gave you lekach tov. I gave you good lekach. Do not abandon my Torah. The Rebbe then gave a Torah lesson about the concept of the sukkah, which was surprising, since Sukkot was already over. However, the Rebbe had saved the lesson because he wanted Reb Noson to hear it. Meanwhile, the wagon driver came and said it was time to return to Nemerov. They asked the Rebbe for permission to leave, but he said to Reb Noson, "I haven't paid you for your expenses yet, and also, you've not given me an accounting for the time since you returned home until now." Reb Noson understood that Rebbe Nachman knew of his distress, and he badly wanted to spend time with the Rebbe anyway. The others returned to Nemerov, leaving Reb Noson behind. During Chol HaMoed Sukkos, Reb Noson had reached an agreement with his father and his father's business associates that Reb Noson would travel to Berditchev for merchandise immediately after Yom Tov. Yom Tov ended in late October, and it was vital to make sure that the inventory was well stocked before the onset of the harsh Ukrainian winter, when mud, snow, and ice would make travel and shipping very difficult. All arrangements for the trip had been finalized, and the coach was already hired. But when the Rebbe asked Reb Noson for an accounting of the past 2 weeks, he forgot all about business. He stayed with the Rebbe the entire night, which to Reb Noson was as bright as daylight. Early in the morning, they went to the mikveh and davened together in the Baal Shem Tov's shul, which was near the Rebbe's house. Rebbe Nachman had an extra pair of tefillin. Since Reb Noson had not brought his, he prayed in the Rebbe's tefillin and weekday talis. In later life, Reb Noson often said, From the time I put on Rebbe Nachman's tefillin, I felt as if I had a new mind. After praying, the Rebbe gave Reb Noson some cake and coffee and said, "Let's go out and talk near the Baal Shem Tov's shul." A large block of wood stuck out near the foundation, and there the Rebbe sat with Reb Noson. Seeing the Rebbe's great warmth towards him, Reb Noson opened his bitter heart and poured out everything, both his progress and his trials and disappointments from the day after Yom Kippur until then. When Reb Noson described the minyan in his father's sukkah, the Rebbe became very excited and began reviewing his Torah lesson of the previous night. In the lesson, he explained that the concept of the sukkah is that of intense prayer, which can help bring children. The Rebbe's exposition of the connection between intense prayer and children came as something of a surprise to Reb Noson, for until then he had not even mentioned his lack of children to the Rebbe. The subject was very timely because after several miscarriages, Esther Shendel was again pregnant, and for the first time ever she was entering her 9th month. The entire family was worried. Reb Noson mentioned the problem to Rebbe Nachman, who said, "For this, you must give a pidyon." Reb Noson replied that he was going to give the Rebbe a gift anyway. Referring then to the lesson he'd given on Shabbos Shuvah, Rebbe Nachman suggested that he should bring 6 chairs corresponding to the Vav, which connects the upper and lower point of the Aleph. They then went to the Rebbe's house to eat the afternoon meal. In due course, Reb Noson brought the Rebbe the 6 chairs, and he ended up having 5 sons and 1 daughter. He later said, "If I knew that the number of children also depended on the pidyon, I would have brought the Rebbe a 12 chairs." After hearing the Rebbe's teaching, Reb Noson was so aroused that he completely forgot about going home. The Rebbe sensed this and said, "Now you must show you have the second kind of expertise, baki b'shov." That means knowing how to strengthen oneself at difficult moments. "You must go home." Reb Noson felt embarrassed because he was still wearing his Yom Tov clothes. How was it going to look if he traveled back dressed this way? The Rebbe suggested he should leave in the late afternoon so that he would arrive in Nemerov at nightfall when it would not be so noticeable. Reb Noson then told the Rebbe about his scheduled trip to Berdichev. He suspected that the others had left without him, which would only add to his troubles because he had promised he would go with them. "Who knows?" said the Rebbe. "Maybe they had difficulties with the wagon driver they hired and they also didn't travel." When Reb Noson saw that the Rebbe was insistent that he should go home, he had no choice but to return to Nemerov, and he left late that afternoon. Reb Noson reached Nemerov after dark. When he came home, his wife was in his grandfather's house. He changed out of his holiday clothes and prayed Maariv at home. When his wife came in, Reb Noson was in the middle of Shmona Esrei. He prayed for such a long time that she fell asleep waiting for him. Reb Noson's devotions included getting up for Chatzos and going to the mikveh, and from there he went straight to the Beis Medrash. That night he did the same thing. When he came to the Beis Medrash, he heard that the other merchants he was scheduled to travel with had not left for Berdichev after all. The coach driver they hired had backed out of the deal and had gone elsewhere. After the prayers, Reb Noson returned home. But when his wife tried to find out where he had been, the other merchants came to tell him they had another coach waiting for them and he must hurry. In the rush to prepare food and pack Reb Noson's clothes, there was no time for Esther Shendel to ask questions, and Reb Noson quickly left the house. Reb Noson remembered the verse, the pasuk, "When God desires the ways of man, even his enemies will make peace with him." He was also deeply impressed by Rebbe Nachman's Ruach HaKodesh and insisting that he go home just then. If the Rebbe could help him so much in material matters, how much more could he help him with his spiritual struggles? This only went to reinforce further his conviction that Rebbe Nachman was the mentor for him. No matter what he would go through, no matter who would oppose him, family, friends, neighbors, Reb Noson decided he would follow the Rebbe. It might seem that Reb Noson's preparations for battle were not all that necessary. He went on his business trip, he came back home, he continued studying even more than before. What was really so terrible about his becoming a Breslov Chassid? Was he all that different? But Reb Noson was well aware of the trials that awaited him. The reason he had met Rebbe Nachman in the first place was because he had delayed his intended move from Nemirov in order to await his father-in-law, whose planned visit kept on being deferred. Reb David Tzvi Orbach was still expected. Indeed, he was due to arrive any day. What would this world-renowned rabbi and staunch misnagid have to say about his newly converted Vidoiniker son-in-law? The end of chapter 6.